Today, we're going to cover everything you need to know regarding emphasis and importance in HTML. And I'm going to use MDN as a nice resource to go through this video with you. So, in the human language, we often emphasize certain words to alter the meaning of a sentence. And we often want to mark certain words as important or different in some way. HTML provides various semantic elements to allow us to mark up textual content with such effects. And in this section, we'll look at a few of the most common ones. So first off, emphasis. When we want to add emphasis to the spoken language, we stress certain words, as I did there, subtly altering the meaning of what we are saying. Similarly, in written language, we tend to stress words by putting them in italics. For example, the following two sentences have different meanings. I'm glad you weren't late. Or, I am glad you weren't late. The first sentence sounds genuine and relieved that the person wasn't late. In contrast, the second sentence with the words glad and late in italics sounds sarcastic or even passive aggressive, expressing annoyance that the person arrived a bit late. In HTML, we use the EM element to mark such instances, as well as making the document more interesting to read. These are recognized by screen readers, which can be configured to speak them in a different tone of voice. Browsers style this as italic by default, but you shouldn't use this tag purely to get italic styling. To do that, you could use a span element and some CSS, or perhaps even an I element that we will later get to below. So if we wanted to create the sentence in HTML, I am glad you weren't late, we would still wrap it all in a p tag. So I'm glad you weren't late would all be in a p tag. But wrapping around glad and late, we would wrap that with an EM element, an opening EM tag and a closing EM tag before glad, and the same thing before late. And this will add that emphasis around glad and late. And as I mentioned, this is important for screen readers, and it will also provide a default style of italic to glad and late. Now, similarly, to emphasize important words, we tend to stress them in the spoken language and bold them in written language. For example, this liquid is highly toxic. I'm counting on you. Do not be late. In HTML, we use the strong element to mark up such instances, as well as making the document more useful. Again, these are recognized by screen readers, which can be configured to speak them in a different tone of voice. Browsers styles as bold text by default, but you shouldn't rely on this purely. To do that, you could use a span with some CSS or the B element, as we'll go over below. So the way that you could do this to add this kind of strong emphasis here is everything could still be wrapped in a P tag or a heading tag or whatever it might be. But then to make those words stand out, you would wrap them in a strong element. So here, this liquid is, and then we open up a strong element, highly toxic as our text, and then we close our strong element. So highly toxic here is going to be in that more bold, kind of strong font here. And then in the second line, we do the same thing, but wrap that around do not. And then you can also nest strong and emphasis inside of one another if desired. So here, if you drink it as just normal text, and then they open up a strong tag, they type you may, and then they also use an emphasis tag, wrap that around the text die, and then close the strong tag. So you may die is really emphasized here because they wrap the EM around die and then the entire strong tag around you may die. So wrapping these around each other is totally valid to do. Okay. Now, as we alluded to earlier, you do have elements for italicizing things, bolding things, and underlining things. So the elements we've discussed so far have associated semantics. The situation with B, I, and U, bold, italic, and underline, is somewhat more complicated. They came about so people could write bold, italics, or underlined text in an area when CSS was still supported poorly or not at all. Elements like this, which only affect the kind of styles of text and not the semantics, are known as presentational elements and should no longer be used because As we've seen, semantics is important for accessibility, SEO, etc. HTML redefined B, I, and U with new, somewhat confusing semantic roles. Here's the best rule you can remember. It's only appropriate to use B, I, or U to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed with bold, italics, or underline when there isn't a more suitable element, and there usually is. Consider whether using strong, EM, mark, or span might be more appropriate. Always keep an accessible mindset. The concept of italics isn't very helpful to people using screen readers or to people using a writing system other than the Latin alphabet. I is used to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed by italic, foreign words, taxonomy, designation, technical terms, a thought. B is used to convey a meaning that would be conveyed in bold, keywords, product names, lead sentence. U is used to convey a meaning traditionally conveyed by underline, proper name, misspelling, etc. Okay, so for the most part, it's probably a good idea to steer clear of I, B, and U and use strong, EM, and mark instead, as those are going to be more semantic and less just kind of like presentational. And it's better to do that presentational stuff in CSS, but there might be a time and place for these here and there. Okay. So that is everything you need to know about emphasis and importance within HTML.